Hi, everybody, and welcome to another fantastic adventure in podcasting. I'm thinking about the word fantastic because if you're a Fantastic Four shirt, I think
Oh, yeah,
this could
for
be
sure.
it. I love it. I love it. So delighted on this episode to be talking with comics creator Dan Brereton. Dan, thank you for jumping in, taking the time on a Sunday to talk with me. Out of all of the things that you have going on, you said you were just doing a painting demo a little while ago.
Yeah. I have a Patreon page called the Night Studio, and every once in a while, I do a little chat, and sometimes I'll do a demo of a drawing or a painting while I'm talking. It's not something I'm used to doing, where I talk
Mhm,
and
mhm.
draw or paint at the same time, but as long as they're not bored, I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, yeah, I love it. I love it. I love the art that you do, and that was one of the reasons why I reached out, of course. You have something in common with Mark Wheatley right now, which is that both of you have skulls in your studios. Just noticing that. I don't know if those are like old friends or if he said his was for drawing on model. Um, but just
I
curious.
I have a lot of skulls in my studio. I mean, my desk has more on them, and then I've got a skeleton over here in the corner.
Hmm,
And whenever I
hmm.
see the first really realistic skull that I own was a Revell snap together glow in the dark kit, which I still have around here somewhere. And you had to put the teeth together, and actually, it wasn't a snap together. I actually had to glue the whole thing together, but I really wanted a realistic skull to draw from, and then later
Hmm.
on, I ended up getting the skeleton, which scares my 3 year old. Actually, all my kids have been scared by the skeleton, but then I explained to them that we all have one inside, and I say, "Here, feel here, and see, you've got
Hmm,
one too."
hmm. That's
It still
cool.
doesn't work. They're still scared of it. But I have a lot of skulls around, and they're all different. Some are less realistic than others. And whenever I go like to a Halloween store or any place where I see one, I have like a really nice one that's green. It has a piggy bank slot in it, but it doesn't have any change in it. So yeah, I
Yeah,
have a lot of those.
yeah,
I think that's par for the course for a lot of artists.
yeah.
Um, especially if you don't want to draw skulls that are cartoony. If you want
Right,
something that
right.
it instantly reads as acceptable rather than goofy. Does that make
Hmm,
sense? Yeah.
hmm.
And
Totally,
you can draw a
totally.
goofy skull that's anatomically correct as well. So
Yeah, yeah. I'm also catching some dragons, some action figures. I just always like to take things in, and you have the
yeah.
Nocturnals over there, which is what a lot of folks out there listening might know you for, as well as the Iron
Mm-hmm.
Giant right there.
Mm-hmm. Giant Killer is one of my other comics, which I don't know if you can see in the wall behind me. That's
Yes,
the
yes, yes.
part. That's the let me move these guys out of the way. That's the slipcase for the hardcover edition I did in 2020, which is kind of like a 20th anniversary
Hmm.
edition. I'd never done a hardcover of it, and now so it's oversized, which is something I always wanted to do since it's a giant monster comic. I wanted to make it a bigger presentation, so finally got
Yeah,
to do that for Kickstarter, which is pretty great.
love it, love it. Um, so my first official question, now that we sort of visited the room, I might ask
Mm-hmm.
about other things on model
No,
too.
that's fine.
But my first official question is sort of that literacy question of what kinds of stories, what were the things early on that inspired you and made you say, I want to be a person who makes art and makes books one day.
Well, that was a thought that I actually had as a kid. I did have that sort of epiphany when I was pretty young that I wanted to tell stories, and that surprisingly, I felt that I had stories to tell. I mean, back when you're a kid, I can't vouch for how interesting they were or how unique or original they were, but I did have that hankering to do that, and I think the probably the main inspiration before comic books was children's books. I spent a
Hmm,
lot of time
hmm.
at the library. I was a voracious reader. I loved picture books pretty exclusively until I was around 11, I would say 10 or 11. Um, and if a book had illustrations in it, to me that made it seem even more attractive, something I
Hmm,
had
hmm.
to dive into. And so that sort of words and pictures things goes way back to probably before I could actually read. Let's be honest. I mean, my mom said that the only thing that could calm me down when I was a toddler was to put me in front of a stack of books. And so when I was 8 years old, in just about the summer of 1974, I discovered comics through a kid I was going to school with. He was from back east. This is in the Bay Area, in East Bay, in the suburbs of the San Francisco East Bay. And this kid was from, his family was from, I want to say Pittsburgh or Philly or something like that. And comics went further back in his family's history. He had an older brother who was, I think, in his 20s, who had a huge collection. He wouldn't let us touch it or look at it. So comics were fairly like a normal thing in their life, in their house, in their family, and they were completely new to me. It was not something that I had grown up with. I found out later that my mom read some comics because she liked cowboy comics and stuff when she was little,
Mhm.
but pretty soon abandoned it. And so I was captivated by the stuff I was seeing. It was Marvel comics for the most part. Jack Kirby,
Yeah,
probably
yeah.
one of the first artists that really jumped out at me, and Captain America. And he just had this great collection. And so I remember asking to go into 7-Eleven one night around the same time and being given $1 to buy my first comics. And
Mm.
back then you could get 4 comic books for $1.
Wow.
I was hooked. I was literally hooked. And I really, that's when I started kind of wrap my head around what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to be an illustrator. I knew I
Mhm.
wanted to be an author. And the idea of doing comic books was this kind of far off dream, because I would look at the artists that I was really interested in and their command of anatomy and the way they could tell a story, and everything looked so effortless and perfect. And I just thought I could never do that.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
it wasn't until, so I went through a period where I was always drawing, I was always writing stories. Um, and I got into the idea of doing comic strips and being a comic strip artist when I was around 11 or 12. So I got heavily into like Walt Kelly and Charles Schultz, Jim Davis doing Garfield at the time. I used to clip out stuff from the paper and keep it in a scrapbook, and was drawing my own comic strips and my own characters. And that seemed to me more, at that age of 12, it seemed more doable and more attainable as a goal than being a comic book artist.
Mhm.
Um, Even though I still loved comics and I still read them. And then around 1977, Star Wars comes along. You get caught up in Star Wars, uh, get caught up in Tolkien and Hobbit and Lord of the Rings and science fiction and just all these things coming at you. But comics was still kind of a through line with all that stuff. It was always a constant. Would come and go in waves. Um, I was always a fan of Conan the Barbarian, and then I discovered Conan the Barbarian wasn't just a comic book; it was this whole series of stories and by Robert E. Howard. And so I was reading all that stuff, and
Mhm.
I would go into a series of deep dives into these different genre and also mediums. And then when I was in high school, I pretty much cemented my feeling that I was going to want to try and be into comics somehow. And I used to try and make my own comics. I was drawing them and writing them, and then took a little break from that when I went to art school and studied painting and drawing and illustration and design and composition and that kind of stuff. And again, that fed back into comics too.
Mhm.
And so one day, when a couple of comic book artists came into my classroom to say hello to my teacher, and that started me down the path toward doing comic book samples and going to conventions. And while I was still in art school, I got my first gig penciling a thing for Eclipse Comics. Very forgettable job. And I remember there was a point in time where I really was admiring painted comics. And at the time,
Mhm.
I was studying illustration in art school at the Academy in San Francisco, Academy of Art College. And I thought, well, maybe I'll try my hand at doing a painted comic book story. And so I did like 7 pages. And I remember showing them to an editor at Eclipse Comics during the Christmas break. And it was just in the middle of my last year of art school, I want to say. And I got hired to do this book called The Black Terror,
Mhm.
painted
Mhm.
comic. And I was working on that while I was still finishing my last semester of art school. And then I just kind of went from there. So it just was a constant process of wanting to tell stories.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. So from the stories that you were exposed to, draws you to the particular stories that you work on? What are sort of those things that you look for in projects?
Well, it turns out to, I mean, my interests were always really heavily into sort of genre fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And actually these days when I'm reading for pleasure, it's a lot of crime fiction, mysteries, whether it's Dashiell Hammett or Raymond Chandler, Ross McDonald. Um, I just picked up a novel by P.D. James, an author I hadn't read before. So I really like that's a genre that I'm really into now. And occasionally I like to read old ghost stories, uh, and some horror. You know, I tend to like go into these deep dives for out of print stuff by guys like Manly Wade Wellman, who was a pulp writer who did all kinds of genre fiction. So I like that kind of stuff, but I also have gravitated toward historical fiction as well,
Mm-hmm.
biography,
Mm-hmm.
things like that, as trying to be a well-rounded human being, and you find that you're interested in a lot of things. But as far as storytelling goes, I think because I like to draw, I tend to gravitate toward things that are fun to draw. For instance,
Mm-hmm.
when I did the Nocturnals, when I started coming up with the idea for the Nocturnals, I knew I wanted to do something that felt like noir and crime and pulp, but I didn't want to draw a bunch of guys who looked like gangsters, and that wasn't really what I was thinking about artistically and imagery wise. I wanted to draw monsters, so I learned a
Mm-hmm.
way to kind of meld the two together and different things that I was interested in, whether it was horror or superheroes or pulp, crime, Halloween, monsters, and just sort of this melting pot came out as Nocturnals. And it's kind of something that happened more than once in my career as a graphic storyteller, whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm.
But I still want to do other things. I'd love to do westerns, again, crime fiction, and there's always something that that kind of grabs your attention, whether it's something I want to draw myself or I want to work with another writer or another artist, I mean, or sometimes another writer. I feel like I have the hankering more than often as not to write things and collaborate with an artist, because there is a lot of work in putting a comic book together, and I'm not a young man anymore, I guess. So even though I still feel 25 in my head, the days of burning the midnight oil to get those pages done, I just don't necessarily have that kind of same energy, nor do I have the same uh, desire
Mm-hmm.
to plunge myself into that. And so when I'm working on, like right now, I have a Nocturnals graphic novel that's all penciled, and I'm working on finishing the pages, color and finishing them out more illustrated, like I normally do. And I'm doing that under my own steam. I don't have a publisher that's breathing down my neck. I don't have a publisher who's paying me. There's no real deadlines, and so it's taking forever to do. But what I'm trying to do is set aside some time toward the end of this year, like maybe last 3 months of the year, to just work on that. And that's
Mm-hmm.
usually my goal, is to set aside time to work on the pages, and then when they're done, then I will put them out however I'm going to do it. But the days where I would sit down and do that many issues under a, say, 12 painted pages a month deadline,
Mm-hmm.
not something I want to run back to necessarily. I'm
Yeah.
pretty comfortable with that. So between Patreon and Kickstarter and doing commissions and doing the spec pieces for, say, I did two comic art live shows this year,
Mm-hmm.
where you basically do an art sale. So I would do special pieces just for the sale and do things that I like to do and things that the collectors like. And that's been really fun. It's been a nice break from having to run a Kickstarter. And next year I'll go back to doing a Kickstarter probably for my next art book.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned collaboration, so curious about um both what makes for a strong collaboration for you and also people that have been particularly strong collaborators on your journey so far.
Well, I find that the people that I want to collaborate with are people whose work I admire. That makes it very easy. I
Hmm.
think that
Hmm.
goes both ways. If someone likes your work enough to kind of instantly, or not maybe not instantly, but to easily sort of conceptualize or imagine the two of you working together on something, and then you get that energy going, and you get excited, whether it's me talking to a writer or another artist, and then you click. You start having conversations about the story or the characters, and then you start clicking, and then ideas start rolling, and there's nothing like it. It's exciting. It's so exciting, and and a lot of times it never goes farther than that. Sometimes that's as far as it goes, even to the point of people sending drawings back and forth. And what do you think of this? What do you think of that? And then someone gets busy or loses steam. Sometimes that happens too. Or sometimes the the ideas don't always gel, and then that sort of dissipates the whole thing. But when you're working with someone and you're committed to working with someone and you trust them, uh, there's nothing like it. That collaboration is just such a rewarding thing, and it's such a growing experience too. You learn how to get along with other people. You learn how to back off from things that may be precious to you in service of the story, which you should always do. But sometimes it takes another person to kind of point it out to you. You can't always know. That's why a good editor is important to have, which I haven't had an editor on a nocturnal story in a long time, although I do consult my friends who are writers or artists, and the ones I really trust, and not stab me with their too honest opinions. That's another thing too, is most artists don't ask other artists what they think of their work, because they might hear the answer, and that can be scary. But yeah, I mean, it's part of, I think, why we do what we do. Some of us do it just to solely be our own person and do exactly what we want, and then some of us like to do that, and we like to collaborate. I think you can only learn something from collaboration, let alone have a good time and create something that's worthwhile. So
Yeah, love what you said there about seeking out people specifically based on the kind of feedback that you want to receive, because
well, I
there
mean,
there are
if you
definitely
trust,
those.
it's true. If you have to trust somebody in order to, it's like when you fall in love. You're giving that person your heart. You're giving that person carte blanche to crush you. I mean, realistically, and they can crush you, but you trust them enough to say, what do you think? Give me your honest opinion, or how can I make this better? And because they respect you and they care about you, they're going to tell you in a way that's not going to just you know devastate you.
Right, right,
Also, you want someone who's on the same page as you. Someone who understands what you're doing, someone who gets it, is familiar with it, is on the same wavelength. Because you can easily get feedback from someone who's not quite in tune with what you're doing, and it might be good feedback, but it doesn't necessarily fit because they're not up to speed with everything you're trying to accomplish. If that makes sense.
yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Makes sense. So you mentioned an art book potentially coming up, and I wanted to ask about anything that's sort of cooking as far as next creative steps that you can talk about, things that you're kind of circling around, as far as what that future work might be, or current work that you'd like to talk about.
Well, currently, like I said, I'm trying to clear some space in my calendar, uh, so that starting September or October, I will be working on finishing more Nocturnals pages that are, again, the whole graphic novel that would be coming out next is all penciled, which means that
Mhm.
the major work is done. It's stories there, the panels are there, everything's there. I need to go into the next step, which is finishes. And so hopefully I can get that done within the next year if I'm lucky, which doesn't always work out, that you have the time, but I'm hoping. And that would be part two of a trilogy. So the first one was Sinister Path, Nocturnal Sinister Path, which came out, geez, 2017, maybe 20, I think so,
Mhm.
something like that. And that was part one of what I realized was going to be a kind of a trilogy. So this second, and then there'll be one more after that. So I really kind of need to buckle down and get these done. And it's hard because you're going to make a living,
Right,
and if
right.
you're not working for a page rate on a book that you're working on, it can make it difficult to find the time. So I'm still learning how to do that. It's kind of still a new thing for me. The first graphic novel was a Kickstarter project, and I think I had 11 pages done when we started it, and then it took another year and a half, 2 years before it finally came out. And it was a long process, and you don't want to rely on the Kickstarter funds to get you through necessarily when you're working on something. Because what if it takes too long? What if there's unseen? You want to plan better than that. And so a lot of the stuff is I'm trying to do more of the stuff on spec up front, so I don't have those unexpected things come up that could railroad things. Because sometimes people they Kickstarter a project, and then they get a certain amount of money, and then the money runs out, and they still have a lot of work to do, including
Mhm.
paying for the printing. And so then what do you do? So you have to make sure that I've run a lot of Kickstarters, so I mean you have to really be prepared. So the
Mhm.
next one will be an art book that I actually was going to do this year. I kind of took a hiatus, and I have so much um, material to put into this art book. But I also was my friend Bud Plant, Bud's art books, Bud Plant comic art.
Mhm.
He suggested, since he's one of the people that would be selling the book, he suggested that I have more text in this one. And so I did an interview with a comics historian, Alex Grand, who's a good friend of mine. And we
Mhm.
did a
Mhm.
long interview, which actually is on YouTube right now. So that was basically to distill parts of that and use that as the text for this book. So there'll be a pretty solid interview piece in there, as well as all the pieces of art. So I expect this art book will be the longest. I'll have the largest page count of any of the art books I've done, because there's so much material to put in. And then there's this text. So I'm looking forward to putting that together.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then the other
I
thing
saw
I have
the
going.
interview. Sorry,
Yeah, oh, you
I
did?
was just gonna
Okay.
say, yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Oh, okay.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's a long one. I don't think we expect we just we got along, we get along well, we have a lot in
Mhm.
common,
Mhm.
and it's easy to do that. And ours is going to go over too, I'm sure. But yeah, so I also we also I got with hooked up with a game designer, professional game designer named Scott Rogers a few years ago, because I wanted to do a tabletop game. And so I had this concept for a tabletop game, a kind of a dungeon crawl thing, but with some unique elements to it, unique to my work, unique to gameplay and things like that. We got really excited. And then we realized if we want to do a Kickstarter for this, there's a lot of research that has to happen. But more importantly, we have to have a lot of these minifigures ready to go. So it costs money to have someone sculpt all those. So when you
Right.
see a Kickstarter and you see, oh, we're going to do these figures, and then we're doing these figures, and then there's 50 figures they're going to give you. They've had to pay a lot to a
Yeah.
sculptor to put or sculptors to put those out there before they even start. So we realized that we needed to rethink how we were going to do our first game together. And I thought, well, could we do a card game? Because that seemed like that would be a lot easier. And he said, yeah, we could totally do a card game. So he came up with a Nocturnals card game that set on Halloween, and you play with your friends or your family, and it doesn't take a day to learn how to play it. Um, which some game people won't like. They want a game that's very in depth and takes and has a thick rule book, but ours
Mhm.
isn't like that. It's fun, and it can take an hour to play. It can take 45 minutes to play. Maybe it could take longer. I mean, we have options for making it more difficult and challenging for those kind of expert gamers. But
Mhm.
I did all the artwork, and we put the whole entire game together last year, and we've been fine tuning it, test playing it. And now it's getting to the point where it's time to start thinking about either whether we're going to do it ourselves, or we've been shopping around here and there to some of the publishers, because we realized it's a big undertaking to put that out. I've never put out a
Yeah.
game, you know.
Yeah. I'm
Um,
sure.
we have like an idea of how to do that, and we can do it. It's just going to be very time consuming. And when I do a Kickstarter, I can only do one a year for
Mhm.
me. Someone else could run it, but my partner in this is not a Kickstarter guy, so it'd be all new for him, which I think it'd be good for him to give it a go. And of course, I would help him. But for me, the art book is just I've done it so many times before that it's it's a challenge and it's a lot of work, but I know how to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. You've traveled that road. You know
Yeah,
it.
yeah, and it wasn't. And I had help in the beginning. I did Kickstarters with other people, partnered up with some folks, and learned a lot, and to the point where it was time to push me out of the nest and do it myself, and I did.
Mhm.
And so far it's been great. It's really great to be able to come up with an idea for a project, whether it's an art portfolio or a book or a calendar or whatever it is, and whether you're doing it by yourself or with someone else, to come up with an idea and then bring it to people and say, what do you think? And
Mhm.
then they say, we want it, and it happens.
Yeah.
And that was never happening in the 90s, and it wasn't happening in the 2000s. And it's really been a game changer for so many people who are
Hmm.
creative and don't want to be uh, dependent on the whims or of the marketplace or editorial or people's tastes or whatever. You bring it straight to the people that want it, and you go from there, and it's a beautiful thing.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Kind of like a podcast. I mean,
exactly. Yeah.
exactly. The tools are there. Go.
Yeah. No gatekeepers, or
Yeah.
very few.
No one telling you can't do it. No one telling you, sorry, this isn't the kind of thing we publish, or we can only pay you this much to do it.
Hmm.
And comic book rates these days are not impressive for
That's what
most
I've
people.
heard. That's what I've heard.
It's just the way it is because of the market. It's just the way it is. So
And it's work intensive.
it's extremely work intensive to the point where one of the things that keeps comics going is the dream, the
Hmm.
comic book creator's dream, which is to make comics.
Hmm.
And, most of us when we're younger, we pursued that dream, and we're willing to take lesser deals
Hmm.
in order to do it. Although when I was coming up in the 90s, the deals were better. There was more money, there was more investment, the marketplace was much more bustling. You
Hmm.
know,
Hmm.
um, and so there was a lot of us had good luck that way. Some people are finding that when they marry themselves to characters or to a publisher who has a pantheon of characters, and they can find success that way, which is another way to do it. If you're drawing a very successful character for a successful company, you create this, which I did to a certain extent in the 90s, but you create this market for yourself, and you create
Hmm.
a readership and a base. And then when that base wants something, you can give it to them,
Yeah.
you know. So
Yeah. Yeah. I think Thrill Killer was one of the first ones. One of the first works of yours that I found and that I saw. And I love that when I look at a page that you've done, I know that it's yours. I know that those unique pieces are there from a character sort of figure design perspective, but also kind of the coloring and the ways that you kind of go about it as well.
well, I never really devised a style for myself ever. I think it was just a thing that came out sort of naturally. But
Hmm.
that's not necessarily the case with all artists. I mean, some artists, they develop a style, but they also make these changes, or they make they have these epiphanies or these revelations when they're looking at other people's work, which I've had them. And a lot of times what will happen is you'll see this thing, and then you incorporate it into your work, especially artists who are self-taught. You see this a lot with artists who are self-taught. They incorporate something into their style, and then it gets absorbed and it becomes part of their larger style.
Hmm.
And most artists have a style that is recognizable that I don't think they necessarily have any control over. It's just what people. It's it just comes from this place that is you can't touch it.
Hmm.
It's going to be
Hmm.
what it's going to be. Other artists are better at kind of rolling with styles or with the ability to kind of reinvent themselves to a certain degree. I mean, if you look at or it's just in a really extreme evolution, that goes into a place that where they become even more popular, maybe, you know. Um, and then there are artists who create a whole style based on things they picked up from one artist or another,
Hmm. Hmm.
or sometimes if even a smaller group of one artist from maybe it's just one artist, and then they'll absorb it, and then they put it back out there, and you can see it. You can say, oh, this guy looks like this guy. Uh, Sometimes you don't always see it right away, but there is probably a group of 10 really solid master comic book artists who it seems like everybody has learned something from or stolen from or borrowed from or been inspired by. It might be more than 10, it might be more like 50, but there's this really concentrated group. And one guy I'll throw out there, obviously Jack Kirby, but
Hmm.
Michael Golden is a name that comes up all the time with comic book artists.
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
know um I was a fan of Michael Golden stuff, but I never never tried to draw like him. I didn't get so into it that I wanted to be Michael Golden. I wanted to be other people. But I hear about Michael Golden a lot, and he's an amazing artist, self-taught, um, and elusive in that it's not easy to get him to talk about his influences because he says he doesn't have any. Everyone's got influences, whether they know it or not. It's just the way things work. But with Thrill Killer, I had this idea to do an Elseworlds because at the time Marvel DC was doing Elseworlds, and the idea was to a world where Batgirl and Robin were the dynamic duo, and it was set like in like maybe the '60s, and they were kind of this thrill-seeking couple that like to fight crime for fun, for kicks, and then something major happens in their lives that affects them, and then it gets serious. And I thought, well, Bruce Wayne would be like a cop. He's like a detective that works for Gordon, and then eventually he would become Batman in the story. And so I wrote this pitch, and I pitched it to Archie Goodwin at DC. He's one of the greatest people in comic books of all time, whether he was an editor, writer, whatever, mentor. And he liked the idea, and I told him, I said, I think I'd like to work with Howard Chaykin on this. I think he'd be good to write it, and it's right. I think it'd be right up his alley. So we showed it to Howard. Howard liked it. We got on the phone. We had a conversation, and went from there. And from there on, it was very smooth in the way things went. It was very smooth in the way the story came out, and the way he picked up on elements and made some things his own, some things stayed. The basic idea I laid out to you never changed because it was just really, it was strong. The details of how things happen in the story were Howard's to tell and to concoct. And then we did a second one, and there was actually a third one that was laid out that never happened. Archie passed away, and most of the editors at DC didn't want to take something that was. There's a lot of competition as far as like, look at this brand new thing I'm bringing to you. So not a lot of editors would want to pick up something that had already come out twice from another editor and then do that when they had other things they wanted to do. So we never did do a third one, which would have been called Thrillmaker and set in 1971. I'd still do it if we could find his plot, because Howard doesn't even remember writing it, but I did read the plot. But we know enough about it that we could make it work. He could just write a new plot line or new storyline. But I remember enough of the gist of it that we could do it. But if they ever asked for it, we would do it. We could probably do it. It'd be a lot of work, but it would be fun, and I think it'd be worth it. And that was one of those projects that was really worthwhile to do. It was very unique. And I was very happy that something that I had sort of just sprang up in my mind was able to come out on as a project. And that, I think, has been the most miraculous things, seemingly miraculous things about comics, is that you can come up with an idea. If you sit down and work on it, you can make it happen. And it used to be a lot easier to do that, because if you found a publisher that was with you, they would say, this is what we're going to pay you to do it, and we're going to put it out. And it seemed like, I remember when I did Nocturnals, I felt that way. And then Giant Killer, when DC Comics, a few years later, DC Comics greenlit Giant Killer, which is a comic that I wrote and illustrated. And I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe they said yes. I was like, this is the greatest job ever. Even movies, with movies, it takes a lot to get a movie made. The fact that a movie gets made and it's good is almost a miracle.
So, lots of hands.
The comic seemed like it was more realistic for someone who knew what they were doing to be able to make things, and it still is to a certain degree. It's harder than it was, but it's still definitely a possibility. And you see the stuff that comes out from independent publishers and stuff that comes out from Kickstarter people. There's some amazing stuff that comes out from crowdfunding. Jay Stevens' Dwellings horror comic that was a crowdfunded book for several issues, and I felt like I'm telling all these people about this book, and no one's like, what's that? What's that? Oh, it's so great. It's like this cute Harvey Comics looking, really dark horror stuff that it's so great, and it's finally being picked up. It's been picked up by Oni. So Oni Press is publishing it, so the rest of the world can enjoy it. Nice. And that started out as Jay's brainchild, and as a Kickstarter, as a crowdfund. So
it's a good time to be creative, I think.
I agree. I agree. And I think if anyone has a hankering to be creative and has something that's persisting, uh, they sh- you got to do it because
Mhm.
this is the market you're going to make. You know, this is your time. Take advantage of it and make it happen for yourself. You know.
Yeah. So, by way of a final official question, and then we can hit anything that we missed. I say they're official. They're semi-official questions.
Yeah.
Um, any web spaces where people can go, crowdfunder sites, things like that, social media, those sort of things where people can follow up and check out some of your work and support.
I'm Dan Brereton Illustrator on Instagram. Dan Brereton on Facebook, and then I have that's my like personal page. I have I think it's Dan the Art of Dan Brereton Facebook page, Nocturnal's Facebook page. There's quite a few Facebook pages that are like public ones.
Yeah.
When I create a Kickstarter, I usually do a Facebook page for it because it makes it easier to promote it. But there's a Giant Killer page. There's a few others. So I'm all over Facebook, and not on Twitter anymore. I left when it was still called Twitter. Um, and then I have a Patreon. It's called the Night Studio, and you can find a link to that on either the Instagram link section or Facebook if you're interested in becoming a patron. I do a lot of process galleries when I'm working on art. I kind of go not step by step, but like I stop and I take pictures and I'll talk about it. And you can see the progression,
Hmm. Hmm.
the evolution of 100 pieces, maybe more, that are on there. Because I started in 2019, so there's a lot of content on there, and I post very regularly. And there are art rewards that might still be available. They open up here and there, but really, it's just kind of a way to share my studio and what I'm working on with people. And For people who want to support an artist, it's a pretty great thing. It's also a way for me to kind of uh, organize my commission list
Hmm.
and keep
Hmm.
it to a certain minimum or a maximum and not get too bogged down. Uh, I have a lot more commissions I do because of Patreon, but I manage them differently than I used to because I know what's coming up and I can
Hmm.
organize my time better. So I really enjoy doing that. And then there's the Kickstarters that come up here and there. I think you can follow me on Kickstarter too, so that when I have a project coming, you can get notified about it. But yeah, I mean those are the basic social media things that I'm involved with. And if you're interested in finding any of my books that are still in print, some stuff that's not in print, I would say budsartbooks.com is your best bet.
Hmm.
The Nocturnals omnibuses, volume 1 and 2, are these big oversized omnibuses. The first one's 320 pages, the second one's 420 pages. Those were put out by Dark Horse last year and the year before, and they're very, very, very inexpensive, but very high quality. And you can get those anywhere online where books are sold. You can also get them through your local comic book shop. But I would say for anything you have a trouble finding, like say the Giant Killer oversized hardcover, that's
Hmm.
only sold through budsartbooks.com. And they
Nice,
have a couple
nice.
different versions. They have the slipcase version, the regular version, they have the sketch versions, things like that. So they live. I don't live too far away from Bud, so we do a lot of business together, and so they've been very supportive, which is great.
Fantastic, fantastic. I'll make sure to link all of those things. And in the video, there will be a little like bar that pops up about right now that
Okay.
has all of that for us as well.
I also should mention that I'm doing the Baltimore Comic Con in September. I'm slated to do Dallas Comic Con in October, and I think that's it for now. As far as conventions I'm traveling to out of state, I do local ones in Northern California here and there, but I don't know if I have anything set up. But Baltimore and Dallas are coming up for me. So if you want to see me there, I'll be there.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dan. Did I miss anything, or did we miss anything to make sure to mention?
No, I think we're good.
All right, all right.
Thanks.
Well, yeah, thank you for a wonderful talk, and glad to talk with you sometime in the future again.
Sure, that'd be great, Jason.